Good morning to everyone, and thank you so much for showing up for the first session of the day. This is material that is fairly new. I'm still kind of, working on the kind of nitty-gritty of it, but I'm very excited to be talking a little bit more about it, and especially in such a beautiful location as this is. So, as was mentioned in the introduction, my name is Jaya, and I'm part of a project called NIM. And what we've built is something called a noise-generating mixnet. Effectively, what that is a kind of combination of blockchain and mixnet technology that scrambles, packets of information as they kind of cross the internet, mix them up, and make it kind of impossible to trace large-scale patterns of communication. So the title of my talk today is Liberating the Self from Calculation, Entropy in Privacy-Enhancing Technologies. And the kind of slightly less wordy version of that title is I'm going to be talking a little bit about technology and freedom, effectively. So because I'm talking about a topic like that today, I feel it's kind of good to acknowledge a little bit the context that this is happening in, the kind of time and space that this is happening in, which is a kind of moment in history where, I would argue that the technology industry has more power than perhaps it has ever had before, and that a lot of that power in the present day is moving, very dramatically towards unfreedom rather than freedom, enabling, detention, incarceration, deportations, enabling also genocide and warfare. So this is a topic that is kind of quite meaningful to me in this particular moment, and I might be taking a kind of angle on privacy here that is a little bit unusual, a little bit unfamiliar. I'm going to be starting from the field of psychotherapy, and there's a kind of few different reasons for why I'm doing that. First of all, I am by training a digital geographer and political economist. And as a geographer, we like to think a lot about scale, and we like to think a lot about how the small scale interacts with the large scale, how human societies interact with the reorganization of territory, with networks. And so this kind of relationship between scale is something that kind of, as I've been reading, some recent literature on psychotherapy, there was some interesting kind of echoes that I saw happening across scale, both from the very kind of intimate and subjective work that happens in psychotherapy through to the kind of infrastructural work that we're doing at NIM. And what that is psychotherapy effectively, actually I might from here just jump straight into the talk because I've already kind of started the topic. I'm going to be taking the talk kind of step by step, working through the title. So initially starting with the idea of liberating the self, and then moving on to, from calculation and what's meant by that, working with some contemporary philosopher, Byung-Chul Han, and then we're moving on to another contemporary philosopher, Cecile Malaspina, to deal with the concept of entropy, before diving into privacy-enhancing technologies and how that relates to the context of artificial intelligence today. But going back to this topic of psychotherapy, so this is really where I want to start from. And what we see is effectively, the work of psychotherapy has to do with working through, your patterns of behavior. First of all, recognizing that you have patterns of behavior, and then trying to understand where they actually come from. Typically when we talk about kind of, the concept of freedom or liberation, there might be this kind of idea of like the freedom of the individual versus the collective good. But the work of psychotherapy, and there's plenty of other practices that also seek to do this, is really to try and kind of, get out of this antagonistic relationship and this kind of schism, to kind of, shift out of a kind of reactive mode and recognize that you are in a reactive mode that kind of repeats certain patterns of behavior in order to work through to a kind of deeper sense of self, that is actually where you can start to kind of act rather than react, and act from a space of sovereignty, integrity, and freedom, rather than out of kind of reaction towards your environment or reaction to kind of past experiences. So what I found interesting about this idea of freeing oneself from patterns of behavior is that in many ways this is what we're trying to do also in the kind of NIM mixnet. We're trying to kind of release patterns of behavior that would otherwise be under the kind of the eye of surveillance by kind of raising the level of entropy. And so I think there's some interesting echoes from the kind of small-scale subjective work that happens in psychotherapy through to the large-scale infrastructural work and how the two actually relate to freedom, especially in this day and age and in the relation to digital technologies. So, so when it comes to psychotherapy, I've been working especially with contemporary psychotherapist Noir Al-Sadir, who wrote this book titled Animal Joy. And in it, she kind of talks a bit about the work that has to do with, I'm going to go a bit closer to these slides, can't really see them very well. So she kind of like sets up two different ways of understanding oneself. So first of all, the kind of schema of psychotherapy, let's say, is at a young childhood age. You start to interact with your environment in order to get things like food, love, connection, security, and so on. And what that, you start to kind of modify your behavior in small ways in order to kind of access these things. And these kind of small modifications in relation to your environment sets up a kind of an unconscious understanding or a set of assumptions about how the world operates. So you start to think, oh, I need to behave in this particular way in order to get connection or access love or access food. And then you start to kind of repeat those patterns of behavior as you move through your life later on. So the work that Al-Sadir, attempts to do in her practice, and, of course, we've got other practices in psychotherapy to kind of try and achieve this, but is to really release these set of assumptions to arrive at not a knowledge of the self that happens via the eyes of others or in relation to others, but a knowledge of oneself and getting to know oneself in relation to oneself internally. And that is where you have this kind of interconnection that actually allows you for a more spontaneous and free action out in the world because you're no longer in that kind of reactive mode. So to quote Al-Sadir, thank you for putting the slides up, preoccupied with how you're known to others, you run the risk of believing you can know yourself only through their perspective, and you will limit your expression, possibly without even realizing it. So again, there is something kind of curious and interesting here for someone like myself who works with privacy technologies, this idea of, constantly reflecting on oneself via the eyes of others via the kind of eyes of a kind of surveilling or judging entity, which in effect starts to limit your expression and starts to limit your understanding of who you are and what you're capable of and where you can go from here. So Al-Sadir, as a psychotherapist, talks about knowing oneself in relation to others, knowing oneself in relation to oneself, this idea of a true self that is outside of that reactive mode. But there is my thinking is that there's something kind of strange that's happened in the past 15 years, which is that we don't just have these two kind of modes, let's say. There's a third kind of way of knowing ourselves that is like very prevalent today and which perhaps psychotherapists need to kind of start to deal with in a little bit more kind of like rigor. Al-Sadir talks a little bit about this in her book. And this is, but doesn't go kind of quite deep enough. And this is the idea or the kind of reality that we live in today, which is that currently we know ourselves increasingly via and through digital technologies, both explicitly in terms of kind of posting content and kind of engaging like this, but also through kind of like more subtle forms of digital profiling and identity systems. And this, I think, has huge implications, both on a personal level and very intimate kind of level in terms of our relationship to ourselves and who we understand ourselves to be, but also has huge implications, geopolitically, in fact. So it crosses, scales in this sense. So a philosopher that I'd like to draw on in order to kind of delve into this a little bit is South Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who's actually based here in Berlin. Contemporary philosopher who has kind of done some work on this topic and is looking at especially relationships of power within this kind of new digital context. And some of you in the audience, I don't know how many read philosophy, but some of you might be familiar with Michel Foucault and his kind of work on biopolitics. what Byung-Chul Han is arguing is that we've shifted out of a context of biopolitics and into a kind of context of psychopolitics. Not that psychopolitics has taken over from biopolitics entirely. Biopolitics is very much around the control of the body, the disciplining of the body, the relationship between a subject and the state, the condition of the body in a factory or in the military. And of course, all of these kind of realities still very much exist. But what Byung-Chul Han is arguing is that there's a new form of power that has kind of, let's say, joined biopolitics and being enacted in new ways through our digital infrastructures. So to quote one piece from this book, it's a very good book, quite short, highly recommend it. So Han says, "Today we do not deem ourselves subjugated subjects, but rather projects, always refashioning and reinventing ourselves. A sense of freedom attends from passing from the state of subject to that of project, but all the same, this projection amounts to a form of compulsion and constraint, indeed to a more efficient kind of subjectivation and subjugation." And of course, this is a kind of subjugation which has to do with the kind of compulsion that we have to continuously reaffirm our identity and engage with digital technologies in that kind of form of way. And so, there is this, to go back to Al-Sadir, there is this kind of third way that we're getting to know ourselves, and that's through the digital self. And that's no longer through the eyes of, individuals that we kind of meet as we go about our day, but rather through the eyes of thousands of people online, potentially thousands of people or more. And also knowing the self as captured by algorithmic and commercial entities, and therefore kind of engaging back in a certain kind of algorithmic fashion. And so, to kind of look at this a little bit in a little bit more detail, I have a kind of developing theory around how we engage with the digital environment and how that affects ourselves. So there's a kind of conscious posting that happens, obviously, right? And here we have the kind of social media. It's like, okay, you want to kind of show to the world who you are, and so therefore you're posting various things, various trivia about your life experiences, your latest outfit, your workout routine, and all those things kind of help you not just show the world who you are, but actually show yourself who you are and kind of allow you to validate this idea of who you want to be. That's kind of one element, but there is also, I would argue, a kind of different form of formation of the self that's happening via digital technologies, which is almost an unconscious self that's being uploaded in a way as well. And this happens primarily via, I would argue, the metadata. So this is your patterns of behavior online. So, the kind of how quickly you scroll past things, the time of the day that you switch on your phone or you're browsing various things. All of that kind of metadata, all that behavioral data says far more about your psychological state and who you are and your relationships and your social graph than even the content posting itself. And so to quote Han again, there is this idea that big data provides the means for establishing not just an individual, but a collective psychogram, perhaps even the psychogram of the unconscious itself. As such, it may yet shine a light into the depths of the psyche and exploit the unconscious entirely. So I very much like Han's idea of a psychogram, and what's meant here is a kind of certain record of our cognitive methods, our cognitive flows, our cognitive, and our behavior, our ways of being online. And this psychogram is a kind of a digital record, constantly updated, living in the cloud. And ready for exploitation in a variety of ways. And I think that this concept is perhaps even more powerful, even better than the idea of mass surveillance, because surveillance somehow assumes that the issue here is consent, right? Where I think what's actually going on here runs far deeper than individual consent. It is around a kind of radical shift in the terms under which we kind of know ourselves as individuals and as a society. And so the concept of psychogram just names, quite beautifully and quite accurately this close relationship between our cognitive ways of kind of understanding the world and being in the world, and its capture into, the gram element, its capture into a kind of database. And so, what do we mean when we say exploitation? Han wrote this book in 2017. This was probably just before the kind of the latest kind of AI boom in a sense. And I think when he was writing it, he probably had an eye towards the kind of commercial exploitation that was happening in terms of targeting and profiling for advertisement or continuous engagement on social media, and kind of this sort of exploitation at a kind of very like consumer level, let's say. But I would say, we're now, with artificial intelligence, we've moved decidedly out of a kind of era of this kind of just consumer level exploitation into a kind of era of automation. Automation not just for consumer technologies, but also for military purposes. And so, we've gone a far way away from the idea that consent can even matter or even kind of like have an empowering effect here. I think we need to move quite radically on from that as our main kind of focus, let's say, for addressing this new condition of exploitation. So kind of having mapped that out, I wanted to talk a little bit about entropy as one possible direction, one possible solution. And it kind of came from reading another fantastic book by another contemporary philosopher, Cecile Malaspina, who's written this book, An Epistemology of Noise. As I was reading it, again, this idea of kind of patterns of behavior versus the loosening of those patterns, the kind of freeing from those patterns, or the dissolution of those patterns. Started to work a little bit on this concept of entropy and this idea that, it could possibly be one way out of, the imprisonment of our collective futures by predictive algorithms. So, of course, the concept of entropy initially comes from physics or thermodynamics, and it defines a measure of disorder in a system. But perhaps more famously for this particular crowd, it's also used in Shannon and Weaver's mathematical theory of communication, and it's a quantification of an average level of uncertainty or information associated with a variable's potential states or possible outcomes. I wanted to kind of quote Malaspina here, just to kind of try and fully open up her understanding of, or her kind of rereading of Shannon and Weaver's mathematical theory of communication. So she writes, entropy indicates what Warren Weaver calls freedom of choice relative to the unpredictability of a message. What this means is that a piece of information informs us only if it is not redundant, if it contains a margin of unpredictability and uncertainty. Basically what she argues in this book is that after the publication of Shannon and Weaver's work, cybernetics started to become kind of quite popular, and there was this kind of slightly kind of reduction of interpretation of what entropy was actually about, and we have this kind of schema in our head of kind of signal versus noise. You either have noise, which is kind of nonsensical, there is no information, we don't understand what's going on there, or you have signal, which is when the signal is coming through, we understand what's going on. But what she's saying here, and what we can see in this quote, is that there's a kind of interesting kind of aspect to information, which is that information is only truly information if it contains something new, something unpredictable, something that we didn't already know. And in order to achieve that, you need entropy. Entropy is kind of the raw material, so to speak, for new information to emerge. Some of you who maybe have been kind of looking a little bit at the history of mass surveillance and kind of geeking out about that might be familiar with the NSA General Alexander's quote, "You need a haystack to find the needle." And that's kind of very much working with this like new concept of what information really means, which is if you need to understand a kind of highly complex situation with a lot of variables, and you want to start to try and make predictions and understand what possible outcomes could come from this, you need a lot of entropy, you need a lot of kind of random data in order to start to surface patterns that might actually show you what could potentially happen next. So there is this use of entropy for calculating possible outcomes in highly complex environments, and we see entropy therefore also being used as the raw material for AI. So there is this stochasticity in artificial intelligence. So that's kind of one use of entropy, but far more important to me is that there is another use of entropy that is perhaps even more widespread even than artificial intelligence today, that actually, rather than enabling calculation of probabilities to make predictions about the future, actually prevents calculation and scrambles predictive patterns. Far more widespread use of entropy, but far less famous or hyped, unfortunately, but maybe we can change that. And that is, of course, the use of entropy in privacy-enhancing technologies. First of all, of course, entropy, as a lot of you will be aware of, is used in cryptography, and is ensures the kind of security of a cryptographic key pair, for example, and ensures the unpredictability of a key pair. And so, there is these kind of course, very poetic sources of entropy, because the question is, where can you get entropy from? What is this? How can we harness the kind of, certain unpredictable forces? And of course, the source in cryptography is either a passphrase, but it can also be these more poetic things, like, I think there's been various artworks of using kind of raindrops, the falling of rain, unpredictable patterns of the falling of raindrops as a source of entropy, or the ambient noise, from your kind of CPU in your computer. These like very poetic, sources of really kind of harnessing that, core unpredictability of the world that we inhabit, basically. But zooming out from cryptography, another example of the use of entropy in privacy-enhancing technologies is in noise-generating mixed nets. So as I mentioned at NIM, this is a kind of infrastructure that we're building. And the idea here is to use entropy to ensure the unpredictability of a route that a packet takes through a network. And we do this by obscuring, patterns of internet traffic, by, shuffling their order, by adding kind of micro-timing delays, and especially by adding kind of dummy traffic that overall kind of just, raises the level of entropy in the network and kind of scrambles patterns of communication. And then another kind of use or example of kind of entropy, or the concept of entropy, is in anonymity sets. So the measure of, you could say that entropy is almost kind of a measure of anonymity in a set. And for example, Polkadot's ring VRF, where the anonymity set is the size of the ring, or Namada's pooled assets and transactions, like multi-asset shielded pool. And so here the source of entropy is, of course, others. So it's like, can we, create this collective force, this collective kind of entropy by adding kind of more people, more kind of assets and so on to the shared pool. So, overall, the kind of, I guess, the outline of the argument that I'd like to say is that I think entropy, to me, is becoming more and more of a framework for really understanding the dynamics that are happening in our digital world today, and the kind of possible kind of directions that we can move in. So, as mentioned, entropy is the raw material, very much the raw material for artificial intelligence, pushing very, very much towards this idea of kind of harnessing entropy in order to make predictions of the future. And I would argue that those predictions, unfortunately, are being used primarily for control, command and control. And so when it comes to this idea of freedom and how technologies can actually enable freedom in this day and age, I would argue that there is another use of entropy where we can move towards enabling emergence, enabling a kind of space for emergence and a connection to a true and spontaneous self, rather than a self that's caught up in kind of past patterns of behavior. And that privacy-enhancing technologies can do this, and can do this both for the individual, but also at a societal level. This is one picture that I feel kind of like very much embodies what, creating a kind of space for emergence and freedom and the spontaneous self to come out kind of looks like. This is my niece. And it's that sort of like true connection to the self, rather than being under a condition of judgment and capture. And I believe this is what, again, we're trying to achieve with privacy-enhancing technologies. So this is, me working through some initial material that is hopefully going to come out as a paper. So, yeah, thank you very much for joining me in this initial rehearsal through the material. And I would love to speak with anyone afterwards if there's any questions.